everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am director of UC Berkeley Social Science Matrix, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. Today we're here to discuss David Robinson's new book, Voices in the Code. It's a book that examines the social life of the kidney transplant algorithm and draws out lessons for the future. And he completed the book while visiting Matrix and the School of Information last year. So we are especially delighted to host this event today. For me, Voices in the Code is a remarkable intervention in a field that has frankly been a bit dispiriting. The book offers, as I said, an investigation of the most hopeful and effective to date deployment of an algorithmic system, the deployment of the kidney transplant algorithm. And the argument is that looking at the successes and shortcomings of a process that was built to be democratic and accountable actually offers precious lessons for building and deploying other kinds of algorithms. In other words, Voices in the Code is not yet another downer on the dangers of algorithmic discrimination and unfairness, but offers instead a set of essential reflections on how to act and design thoughtfully, inclusively, and democratically. Today's event is part of our Author Meets Critics series, which features critically engaged discussions about recent books by faculty and alumni in UC Berkeley's social science divisions, and also, a little bit outside, as we could see. As always, before we begin, I will mention a few upcoming events. On Friday, we will be hosting another Author Meets Critics event featuring Derek Scott's book, Keeping It Unreal, which examines how Blackness in fantasy genres challenges white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Next week, on Thursday, October 20th, we will be having a Matrix on Point event entitled The Court and the People, about the ideological shift in the Supreme Court and their most recent round of decisions. On November 9, we will be having a book event featuring Sandra Eder's new book, How the Clinic Made Gender, about the intersections of science, medicine, and gender. And finally, on December 2nd, we will be having another Matrix on Point called Myth and Misinformation, with a panel of scholars discussing how misinformation circulates and the effect of myth and stories on society. And you can find a lot of other really interesting stuff on our website. I think I forgot to thank our co-sponsors for this event. The Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group, or AFOC, the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, and the Center for Long-Term Cyber Security. So now, let me turn to the panelists. David Robinson is a visiting scholar at Social Science Matrix and a member of the faculty at Apple University. From 2018 to 2021, he developed this book as a visiting scientist at Cornell's AI Policy and Practice Project. And as I said, he finished it last year. Earlier, David co-founded and led Upturn, an NGO that partners with civil rights organizations to advance equity and justice in the design, governance, and use of digital technology. Our first critic, and she will also moderate the conversation that will follow, Deirdre Mulligan. We're very lucky to have Deirdre here. She's a professor. She doesn't barely need an introduction. She's a professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley, a faculty director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, a co-organizer of AFOG. Her research explores legal and technical means of protecting values such as privacy, freedom of expression, and fairness in emerging technical systems like the ones we are discussing today. Her book, Privacy on the Ground, Driving Corporate Behavior in the United States and Europe, is a study of privacy practices in large corporations in 5 countries. And it was published by MIT Press. And finally, we are very fortunate to have Iason Gabriel from the UK, but temporarily here in the Bay Area. Iason is a staff research scientist who works in the ethics research team at DeepMind. His work focuses on the relationship between artificial intelligence and human values, including questions of democracy, participation, and social justice in the context of AI. Iason's background is in political and moral philosophy, and he taught at the University of Oxford and worked for the United Nations Development Program before joining DeepMind. So I apologize for this long introduction, but it was well worth it because our panelists really deserve it. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, everybody who's here, both in the physical, literal sense and in the extended virtual online sense. It's a real thrill to be able to share the finished work after, as Marianne alluded to, a years-long journey. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is try and give you a sense of the argument of the book. Of course, there's a lot that's in the book that won't be in the overview, but the spirit of it, I hope, can come across. And as Marianne said, it's a case in which some great care was taken to try and have a democratic and participatory approach to algorithms, and particularly to the values that are embedded in this particular context. And the success, I think anyone involved would say, and I certainly would say, was not complete, but some good things were achieved, and we have some learning opportunities from this process. So I'm going to start the story here at this inconspicuous airport Marriott in Dallas, Texas, on a chilly day in February of 2007. Now, it's an all-day meeting in the ballroom of the hotel. Hundreds of people are there involved in kidney transplantation. There are surgeons, there are nurses, there are social workers, transplant recipients are there, living donors are there, and it's the early afternoon. And right now, Clive Graw has just taken to the stage. You see his picture in the corner there of the slide. Clive is a 54-year-old traffic engineer from Los Angeles. He's the first person who doesn't have either an MD or PhD to address this group. What Clive does have is a rare genetic disease called a polycystic kidney disease, or PKD, which means that he will in time need a kidney transplant. But what are all these people doing in this room? They are working to revise the nationwide algorithm that matches transplantable kidneys to waiting patients. There are more than 100,000 people today waiting for a kidney transplant in the United States. And there is a matching algorithm. People often talk about a waiting list for organs, but it's actually not a queue with a first come, first served structure. It's a matching. And about 15,000 transplants per year are coordinated through this process. So I'm not talking about the circumstance in which someone gives a kidney for their loved one or their friend or something like that. What I'm talking about is a donated organ has become available. There are many people in need. It's been done, this process of creating a rank order list of prospective recipients, that is to say, a list of offers, has been happening for about 30 years. Why is it interesting? It's interesting for many reasons. Of course, if you need a kidney, it's very interesting. I don't have background in medicine, but what I do in general is to think about how values are embedded into software. And here I was interested, and this actually came from a student paper when I was teaching at Georgetown. They were the first to flag this as a topic, the organ transplant system. You've got a rule embedded in software that has high moral stakes, and it's being governed with community input. The decision logic is public. It's carefully designed. There's auditing. The auditing is actually done by a third party, not by the people who operate the system. And advocates and legislators are asking for similar kinds of controls in the EU, in the AI Act, in some recently proposed federal legislation, state activities, even some local municipal efforts to get things like auditing or public input for things like what's happening in courtrooms, assessing people's riskiness, or who's eligible for welfare. So it seems like there's a lot that we could learn. But anyway, back to this hotel room in Dallas. there's a specific proposal on the table about how to give out kidneys, and that is to maximize the total benefit from the supply of organs. In other words, give each organ to whoever would gain the most years of life from receiving that transplant, as best we can forecast. Of course, no one knows the future, but we can make an effort to figure that out. That effort has a name. The name is LIFT. This is obviously taking place in the era before ride sharing, life years from transplant. So let's step back a little bit and get a little bit of context. So the moral challenge here actually began before there were very many transplants. It began, in fact, with Teflon, the same material that was used for nonstick pans. Kidneys do a lot of things for us. They filter the blood of toxins, is probably their conventionally described as being their main role. People in general have two of them, but you can be healthy and happy with just one. Dialysis is the name for filtering, hemodialysis in particular, is the name for filtering blood outside of your body. And the first time that was done by machine was actually during World War II in Holland. But there was a problem, which is in order to clean your blood, we have to get it out of your body and put it back in. And there would need to be a large bore needle every time that was done. And so after about a month, if someone didn't have working kidneys, we could filter their blood for about a month. But after that, we would run out of places to put the needle. And so people would have, in one source, it was described as Lazarus-like recoveries from this deathly illness. I'm just going to grab my water over here. But then would fall back into mortal illness after they couldn't get dialysis anymore, until in 1960 or so, Belding Scribner, who you see at the top there, invented this flexible nonstick Teflon tubing, which meant that the same person could receive dialysis over and over, potentially for many years. So that was a huge breakthrough, that people without working kidneys and who couldn't, you could at this time, you could get a transplant if you had an identical twin around. But that was about it. You couldn't get a mostly transplant from a stranger because your immune system would be likely to reject it. So Scribner has this new invention. He has dialysis machines, but he only has 4 of them. And there are thousands of patients who need dialysis. Of course, the ethos in general in medicine is to fight for the life of each patient. Doctors don't like to think of themselves as arbiters of who should live and who should die. So Scribner actually decides he doesn't want to do this social ethical job of rationing the care. That's a job for the community. So he creates a committee, which you see published here, pictured here. Doctors would say who was medically eligible, and then these lay people, these 7, would pick from among the medically eligible patients. And these people were appointed by the local medical society. You can see a clerical collar on one of them. There's a housewife, the lone woman in the group with the reading glasses in her hands there. This did not go over well. This was too ad hoc. They tended to favor income earners with families to support, men typically. A couple of scholars wrote that the Pacific Northwest is no place for a Henry David Thoreau with bad kidneys, right? They weren't going to give these scarce slots with these dialysis machines to artists. Now, again, here we're looking at who gets dialysis, this mechanical treatment, and we're later going to be looking at who gets a transplant. But essentially, the question is, there's this shortage. There's not enough of this life-saving resource to go around. And this, I would submit, is where the tradition of involving lay people in making those hard decisions begins for kidney medicine. And that tradition was still happening in Dallas in 2007 when they were debating the design of that algorithm. And so there's a lot to dislike about this early experiment, certainly. It is ad hoc, it's unprincipled, there's all kinds of opportunity for unfairness, but there's also something profoundly honest about it. And there are some important principles that it reflected that I think are worth hanging on to and that were in fact retained. The technology might be complicated, but the hard ethical choices in any case belong to a wider community and not only to the technical experts. And by the way, in order to get the ethical input we need, it's necessary to bring lay people into the fold, to bring them up to speed so they'll know what's at stake. So there was a whole training thing for the committee members. Here's how dialysis works. Here's what's at stake. And so there was a decade of debate between about 2004 to flip forward again here to 2014 over how to redesign this software that offers organs. And by this point, there are decades of tradition of involving lay people in the hard ethical choices. So here's the leading journal of transplantation. You see the apple of equity and the orange or possibly lemon of utility depicted on the cover of the magazine. So, and what these meant, these were sort of code words that equity meant giving everyone the same chance who shows up and needs an organ. Utility meant maximizing the total benefit. And the big question was how to balance this. This, by the way, this is 2009, so this is around the middle of this debate. And there were three ideas, basically, that were considered in turn about how to do this in the story that's told in the book. The first one, the one that was under discussion in Dallas, is called LIFT, as I mentioned, Life Years from Transplant. And the idea is you're going to forecast how much additional life each person would get from each given organ. So this was quite intricate under the hood. There was a forecast that was based on predictions about the kidney and predictions about each patient and how they lined up. So there was a distinct lift score for every possible pairing between a kidney and a person. There was a score about the person, there was a score about the quality level of the kidney. So public, transparent, but extremely complex. Even specialists found the complexity daunting. And the proposal was basically the higher the quality of the kidney was, the more heavily the total amount of benefit would be prioritized. So for the biggest, for the kidneys that were healthiest and could yield the longest life, it would be very important to put at the top of the list whoever would benefit the most. For organs with relatively less likely survival left in them, for instance, or organs from older or less healthy donors, there would be more emphasis on a how long have you been waiting, kind of a fairness based approach. And one of the things that happened was there's an auditing group, you see its logo here, the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, that simulated who would get organs if this new plan were introduced. And what you see is, so the current rules, that is to say the pre-debate status quo in pink, shows that a lot of the organs go to people in their 40s and 50s, but the proposed lift approach in the teal color would have tripled roughly the fraction of transplants received by recipients in their 20s and cut by half the rate of people in their 50s. And so this simulation, partly because of Clive as a patient arguing, it would be unfair to disfavor older patients, and partly because of quantitative analyses like this, was rejected. And then they went to a second proposal. This would have essentially partitioned the kidneys by quality and would have given priority it would have changed not how likely each person was to get a kidney at all, but instead who gets which kidneys. So you can imagine they were able to say to everyone under this plan, your chance of getting a kidney doesn't go down, but there was a kind of rerouting where the healthiest kidneys would go preferentially to those who could benefit most. And by the way, when we think about who can benefit most, who is that? It's often people who are younger, as the prior slide indicated, but it's also people who are by and large wealthier, by and large whiter, by and large have better access to care and have fewer comorbidities, so that if we take care of this kidney problem, there's going to be more survival. And that's one of the things that was wrong with, in the view of those who objected, this lift proposal. So this would have used age matching. So you would have gotten, people in their 50s would have gotten basically kidneys from donors in their 50s. That was for reasons that are too intricate to get into here, was seen as age discrimination and was rejected. They ended up in a sort of messy compromise position with the final proposal that was actually adopted and is more or less in operation now. There were a lot of changes that happened. One thing that happened, this shows you by race, the likelihood of getting transplanted. So essentially, if you think race should not determine who gets a transplant or shouldn't influence who gets a transplant, then you would expect to see or hope to see these lines at the same position on the y-axis. There was a convergence here, which implies or was interpreted as an improvement in race equity. One of the reasons for that was that instead of allowing people to accumulate waiting time based on when they first sign up for the list, which people with better access to care tend to do earlier, they instead said it'll go from the time either when you sign up or when you began to need dialysis. So in other words, for people who had been on dialysis a long time before becoming transplant candidates, perhaps because they weren't as closely followed by doctors, they got a benefit from this shift. So that's just, I mean, one among the many, what is this? This is figure 13. There are 100 figures in the annual report that analyze various facets of the impact of this system. So there's a lot going on, a lot to unpack here, as they say in the hopeless academic cliche. So what can we learn from all of this, I think, is the question I was asking, and that I imagine many of you are likewise curious about. I have 6 takeaways, and I'm going to close with those. First, algorithms shift our moral attention. So this particular way of making these prioritized lists of who was going to be offered an organ, it allowed people to prioritize waiting time, which was calculated in the algorithm, or prioritize total gain of life, which was also in the algorithm. Then there were other things that were also important to who gets an organ that were not dials easily tuned in this software. For instance, there are some arbitrary geographic boundaries involving how the organs are gathered. Catchment areas known as donation service areas, which are basically historical accidents. And they were not up for debate in this conversation. And in fact, after the new algorithm was made, there was litigation that swept them away and changed things. So there are ways in which sort of the design of the system changes which moral questions seem to be available for reconsideration. Second, participation creates opinions. What do I mean by this? Often, I would, before this project, have thought about public input as being valuable in the design of a morally controversial algorithm. And when we're dealing with software, we have technology, we have quantification, we sometimes have a sort of engineering mindset where we think about inputs and outputs. And it's easy, I think, to fall into a pattern of belief where the public's opinions about what ought to happen is just one more of those inputs, along with the relevant data. But democratic deliberation is really messy, and people are not, as data is, sort of static once generated, right? People are always changing. Their opinions are always changing. What they are willing to tolerate or regard as a tolerable compromise is changing over time. And in fact, people's arguments about what would be reasonable can change one another's minds. And that did happen here. So, whereas I think I began by seeing public input as a kind of measurement exercise where we're going out and trying to detect, what is it that people think would be reasonable? I ended up by thinking of it much more as a kind of constitutive practice where the listening and the arguing helped to create the opinions and helped to get to a point where people found one outcome, if not ideal, at least mutually tolerable, which I think in today's political climate is no small feat. Third, in order to have people understand a complex system and meaningfully give input into its design, there's a lot of work involved in educating people about how the system works, what the technical possibilities are, how it's been going, what the racial or age-based or other equity impacts are of the system as it is and the alternatives that might be. And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work beyond the work that is necessary just to build the system. And so the resources for that are one of the really important inputs in making this meaningfully possible. And I do think while transparency, people talk about things like transparency of source code, and certainly it's understandable and important that people want to know that the thing is working, actually working the way that it theoretically should. But I would say that the explanations that lay people need are separate. Those are, plain language explanations, as the recent White House proposal had it. And I wish I could claim that that's a total coincidence, but in fact, I was briefly involved in helping to build that. And anyway, that's one of the things is, can we have things be laid out in a way that makes engagement by lay people possible? Fourth, deliberation is costly and its details matter. That may sound like a trivial observation. Of course, details matter. But in this case, what I'm making is a strong claim here that the details mattering means that the bottom line assessment of whether or not deliberation is worthwhile in a particular case turns on exactly how it's implemented and can't be rendered at a high level of abstraction. Fifthly, quantification can be a moral anesthetic. There is a sense in which numbers seem neutral. We often, in the circles that gather us here, often think about and work on this problem in various ways. It's usually seen as bad that numbers seem neutral. And it often is something that I would assess as a problem. But I think it's also true that it's not always bad. There is a certain way in which creating a conversation where we give ourselves neutral reasons to do difficult things. It's part of how we cope with difficult realities. And finally, there was an elaborate process here to develop this algorithm in an inclusive way and to have its moral logic be accessible. And those things did occur. And then, as I briefly mentioned, there was a lawsuit after this all was done that wiped away some of the geographic boundaries underpinning the design of the carefully designed, democratically designed system, and that was a court intervention. And so what I would say about that is that, and so the careful work described in the book does continue to control what happens, but it's not the only thing that controls what happens. This lawsuit is also an important part of the story. All of which is to say that no matter what we establish by way of new practices, new institutions, there's always going to be the existing legislature, the courts able to intervene and change things. And I guess that's worth bearing in mind. So that's my overview. And now, like the rest of you, I get to find out what other people thought about this book. I'm very excited.
Wonderful. So I should start with the proviso that hadn't fully internalized that this was an author meets critic event. And a lot of what I'm going to say will be encouragement and appreciation for David's wonderful book. So, I mean, the book is remarkable in many ways. It takes a really detailed, intricate technical matter and really understands, the human costs and consequences of decision making. I was very moved by the discussions of early transplant medicine. You hear about doctors who are performing 20-hour operations back to back with very, very limited chances of success, even knowing ahead of time that they will often fail in this undertaking. And there's a kind of humanism in the story that is really there throughout and entirely warranted. I was also very, very impressed by the process of deliberation and the result of the deliberation. So you start off with what seems like an intractable moral dilemma. On the one hand, you have, the scale of utility. You might think it's a truism that medicine should be used to save the greatest possible number of people, or, add the greatest contribution to people's lives. And on the other hand, you have this question of fair treatment in a very, very high stakes domain between individuals, and then also on a collective level between groupings of different members of society. And ultimately, the process that's arrived at seems to not discount any of these considerations. So there's prioritization for people who will benefit a lot. There's individual equity considerations that are built into the algorithm. And it also achieves this amazing effect of reducing some really salient group disparities that are incredibly hard to overcome in society in general. So David has a passage in the book, which actually really captured a lot of how I felt about it, where he says, seen in a certain light, the story of the moral debate over transplant algorithms is beautiful. It has almost all the things reformers tend to want. There was participation and transparency. There were published forecasts. Once the system finally did roll out, there were published audits. Complex technical matters were rewritten in plain English so that patients and journalists could decipher what was going on. And not only this, the procedures were not just frills, they made a practical difference. So I think this is really important because when it comes to evaluating technological artifacts, social systems, it's very illuminating to know how good they could be, right? And actually, I hadn't written this in my notes, but in political philosophy, there's a debate about whether we need something called ideal theory, which is whether we really need to understand how good things can be in order to improve upon the status quo. And some people think that it's important because these long-term ideals help us navigate, the path of our journey in the right direction over many steps, but they can also be inspiring. And that's what I see here today. The story is also kind of surprising and in some ways impressive from the standpoints of political philosophy, which is my own background. So one thing that I found surprising was how resolutely people rejected the initial proposal, right? Because you might just think, sometimes when people think about the logic of medicine, they're like, it has to be this to save the most number of lives or the greatest, add the greatest welfare contribution. And I found it striking the extent to which that narrative, or it's not even a narrative, that argument was one that did not meet with public approval. So instead, people say that the equity considerations matter much more. And they don't believe that this roughly utilitarian structure of argument, which is also highly prevalent in public life when we think about cost-benefit analysis and the way in which we evaluate things, is an adequate rendition of what it means for something to embody the value of justice. So I almost took that as a note to myself. Okay, the public do not believe that utilitarian solutions are just, and I think that's a really important data point. It's also quite amazing from the standpoint of what we might call Republican political theory. So there's a long tradition of people who talk about deliberative democracy. For example, someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau would be an exponent of this view. Also Joshua Cohen, and they say in small communities, if you get people to deliberate, you can achieve these remarkable feats of kind of coming up with sophisticated, publicly endorsed arguments. And moreover, they make this claim, which I always thought was really quite implausible until reading this story, which is that people almost become better through the process, right? So instead of offering these narrow, self-centered reasons, they learn to offer kind of public reasons, which are considerations that apply to everyone. And not only is this a kind of empowering experience, but their preferences shift in such a way that you can achieve solutions that weren't necessarily there before. And to some extent, that seems to have happened here, although in the kind of the more critical questions, I'll press David on the extent to which this really happened. So genuinely inspiring. And just to note that this idea of a preference shift is really kind of stands in stark opposition to what we hear about algorithms today, which is that they're, acting on us, often, often animated by the logic of the market. They're trying to kind of make us more amenable consumers. And it seems that through this kind of public participatory process, we get preference shift of a different kind. We get like moral preference shift, which is a really unusual thing. Okay, so on to the kind of key questions. Many of these, I should acknowledge, David really does flag in the book. So I'm just gonna essentially ask him to tell us a little bit more about them. The first one is to what extent this is a template for the ethical governance of algorithms in an age where they're embedded in all facets of social life. So David talks a lot about the kind of the time spent in this deliberative process, and it took somewhere between 10, maybe it depends when we start the kind of the discussion, maybe even 20 years to come up with this thing. And in this connection, there's the kind of bittersweet quip of Oscar Wilde's, which is in the book, which is that socialism won't work because there isn't enough evenings in the week. So it's like, how could we continuously deliberate about all these important things? But it's also true that the entire context is very, very unusual. And this is something that David does flag, which is that it is not a market context here. You know, that the ground level truth is that these are organs that are kind of legally defined as gifts. And as David says in the book, that creates a presumption that this is a matter of public benefit and that public deliberation is the way to go. And I am curious about whether there is a way to kind of tap into this logic in all the other domains of life where we see algorithms malfunctioning. For example, in welfare provision and in the criminal justice system. So that's the first question. The second question is essentially kind of building on the first, like what other things do we need to have in place to ensure that participation goes well rather than poorly? So there's a kind of pointed counterexample, which David alludes to in the book, which is when we think about zoning laws and kind of these calls for like public consultation. I mean, to my mind, they often end in what I would say is like a moral disaster. You know, people become extremely egotistical. They become, you know, they won't incur any cost for the sake of others. And actually, it looks like, particularly in the Bay Area, this is kind of really gridlocked the ability for there to be social progress. And I have a hypothesis, which is that in that case, one of the challenges is that the processes, the public processes we have, are not yet sufficiently inclusive. So if you were to think about those processes and you were to imagine that people who are homeless were actually included in them, and they could make their case, which is like the current system leaves me with nowhere to live, that would immediately be one of the most salient claims that the system had to speak to and answer. But somehow when we see what's happening, it's kind of a debate between elite factions at a table. And I was wondering if there's insights there that might be helpful to reflect upon. The third question, I only have 4, so don't worry. The third question is essentially what is to ask David what we see when we look at this process in a more thoroughgoing way through the lens of power relationships. So there's something quite subtle in this process, which is essentially that there is the public participation, but the public participants essentially provide input to and ultimately reject a series of expert proposals. And the experts are kind of tasked with like synthesizing knowledge. There's this kind of back and forth between two bodies. It isn't just the public on their own kind of coming up with ideas. And I'm curious like where the power ultimately resides in this process and what your thoughts are. And I was also interested to note that the technologists themselves don't seem to be a kind of headline act in this story. It isn't the kind of computer scientists who are exerting a kind of beneficent or maleficent influence on social outcomes, whereas in other debates around algorithms, that really is kind of front and center of the picture. And then finally, a philosophical question, which is, I'm curious about how much trust you have in these processes, having looked at this one and these processes in other domains of life. in the context of very powerful forms of artificial intelligence, which is what I work on, we often have this central question, which is the question of value alignment. So what values to encode in these systems? And there I've always argued that instead of trying to identify the correct moral philosophy, like utilitarianism, save the greatest number, actually we need these fair processes to come up with rules and guidelines. But I am also aware that sometimes people can make serious mistakes, right? Like the kind of the moral solutions that people can put forward will to some extent be anchored in the common sense morality of the society that they live in. And it is possible that processes of this kind will have blind spots, whether it's, say the suffering of non-human animals, or I guess forms of parochialism that perhaps we see in the kind of the debate around housing in certain contexts. So yeah, my final question is like, having looked at this matter, do you feel increased trust in the ability of people to do this, or do you still have concerns about high stakes deliberation and context? Thank you.
So first, I'm feeling very bad for David because he's going to have to try to keep all of these questions in his mind. And I'm kind of thinking maybe I should give you a chance to engage, but I think we set out a structure where you're going to get kind of bombarded by praise, questions, and then have a lot to digest, and maybe you can weave it all together. So I'm really delighted that this book is in print and want to commend all of it to all of you. I think David has done a really terrific job of centering the humans at the heart, or kidney, right? We could make a bunch of bad puns of this allocation issue, while still like really deeply engaging with the technical minutia, right? That embodies the value choices that affect people's real experiences. I have a family member who needed a kidney transplant. I myself have had those wired, the tubes up my arms, right? Your veins eventually don't like them, I do have to say. But I very much appreciate many arguments in this book and many of the takeaways. One of my favorite is this idea of figuring out how to share the moral burden, right? That I think all of us want to sidestep tough choices. Politicians are certainly like all the rest of us. And the ability to kind of kick some of those hard questions down the line, or to suggest that they are just technical, that they can be left to kind of the implementation details, so that they can kind of fade into or be absorbed into the code and disappear from view and from contestation, I think is something that we struggle with independently and collectively, right? And of course, relying on experts to figure out the details necessary to bring a law or a policy into action to give it life is a standard part of policymaking, right? If you look at law and you look at administrative law, which is where all those technical detailed rules get put into place, I can tell you which one is much more vast, right? And it's all of those sticky implementation details. And so, from that point of view, this is telling us something that we all know, right? That we often need to delegate some of the details to experts. And I think that this really helps us highlight the importance of making sure that the entities to whom we delegate such tasks have the appropriate capacity, legitimacy, right? This is technical expertise, this is tools, this is processes to do that work. And, David notes that my colleague Ken Bamberger and I have written a little bit about the ways in which currently our administrative agencies, our legislatures, our courts are really poorly designed in terms of structural accountability mechanisms, relevant expertise to deal with technical design issues, even those that incorporate and kind of have such a heavy moral weight. And so this poses a real challenge. And I think we often criticize the designers, the engineers, but often we also unintentionally kick hard issues into their court and then yell at them later, right? And so what does it mean to actually partner with people to do this hard work? One of the things I also really appreciate the book is David's detailed exploration of the organizational work, right? That you might read this book, it says voices in the code, and there is code in there, but as Iason said, there's not a lot of computer scientists or engineers. What there is a lot of work about new committees, new ways of interacting, new accountability features, right? Some of which were required by the law, but many of which emerge, right? This is like a community grappling with and struggling with, what does it mean to be accountable for the tools they put out into the world? What does it mean to make an algorithm that is going to be a central feature that has to be useful and equitable and align with ideas about justice that are, as Iason said, much more complicated than we might think about in a philosophy classroom, right? Or if we kind of like, play those games about, the moral machine. So his description and attention to the institutional reworking required to make just algorithms, or at least support efforts to develop and use them in just ways, I think shows an important area for research and practice that today I think is kind of underdeveloped. The algorithmic accountability, responsibility conversation has a tendency to fall into the techno-solutionism, right? We need principles for the redesign of tools. We need new engineering practices. And I think David's exploration reveals the importance of expertise, of boundary objects that help disparate professionals, the public, policymakers to interact, and the importance of building systems that support and protect the trust that is so central to the development, adoption, and most importantly, legitimacy of technologies that we use in governance. And so this attention not only to capacity, but to legitimacy of the institutional actors. You talk about not just what kind of technical expertise they had, but that they were independent, or that there was oversight, or they were accountable to particular individuals with particular needs. So this begs the questions of like, whose analysis will be trusted? What is the relationship between trust and transparency, both in kind of making it, building it, and I think really importantly in sustaining it? And what does it mean to have meaningful voice in a system that has such dire consequences for so many? So part of David's work here, I think, also helps us expand beyond today's obsession with impact assessments, right? I think David gives us a really appropriate overview of a range of techniques: participation, transparency, forecasting, and auditing, that new governance scholars have identified as useful in development of public policy. But he also partners it with a really detailed description of how they were used and to what benefit and with what limitations in the development of the kidney allocation system. So in doing this both high level and kind of very deep dive, I think he lays bare in a really useful way some of the strengths and weaknesses of each. And I think even more importantly, the connections between them and the human labor of different experts and affected communities necessary, not just to use them in a performative way, but to use them well. And so, for example, right, he noted in his closing slide that participation makes opinions, right? It doesn't just source them. And so when we think about like polling activities and other ways that we take stock of our values, that's an orientation that suggests that our values are out there like apples that can kind of be picked off the tree, rather than something that we wrestle with and come to understand in conversation with others. And I think there's some interesting technical work that's been done on this. Min-Kung Lee has some really fascinating research, right, where she shows the ways in which people's preferences, people's values, right, change as they see the outcomes that different rule sets might generate, and they actually can discuss them and appreciate the actual human beings who are going to be advantaged and disadvantaged by those different rules. So more than building an algorithm, I think David shows us what it means to build a community, right? That while full of independent interest, has a shared mission, a shared struggle, and compassion for other members. And Iason already talked about some of the details David provides us that helps us understand both the lived conditions of people with kidney disease, but also like the just magnanimity, yeah, and like effort of physicians who are trying to deal with scarcity and doing all this, like, I'm sure uncompensated labor, right? Of like, logistics and organization. And it really, helps us understand the level of commitment and compassion this community has towards their shared endeavor. So finally, I think David's book really shows us the evergreen nature of the questions and challenges that we're facing today. How do we account for things that happen before or outside the system? Or what does it mean for something to be outside the system rather than kind of considered within our design of the system? What background differences in the person who is presented must be addressed in design, and which can we comfortably, justly agree to set aside? So that brings me to some questions. The story David tells us is one where there is both, I think, a lot of clarity about goals and also about like, this is a public benefit, a public resource, right, that people are talking about. And although there are many, many, many important value-laden choices required to refine and agree upon the concepts and choices necessary to achieve it, and I think a real recognition of the nothing about us without us refrain, that is not typical of many of the kind of algorithmic systems that we are looking at today, right? Many of the algorithms that affect daily living, including important life-altering decisions, are constructed from the perspective that the subjects of the system are antagonistic, right? Or at least strategic and not necessarily sharing goals with those other participants as well as the designers. Efforts to weed out fraud or assign attention, they don't imagine a community, right, with shared goals, let alone values and like everybody marching in the same direction. So how do we think about the lessons in these other contexts where goals are disparate, trust is thin, perhaps non-existent? What does that mean for the kind of institutions, relationships that you saw in this area? How might we take some of the lessons and create outcomes everyone can live with in these other really contested and I think antagonistic spaces, which of course makes me think about elections, right? That like we both want good systems and we want ones that are viewed as legitimate by the losers. And the kidney community, seems to have acquiesced to the current system. There's an agreement, but in many contexts, this seems like an unimaginable result, right? And for me, I've been thinking a lot about the Census Bureau's use of differential privacy, and they did a lot to kind of engage the community, to use different boundary objects to support understanding and public participation in technical details. And yet I think that there are antagonistic goals and disparate and big P politics as well as small p politics that prevent some of the same techniques from functioning well. Second, I think there are some really interesting lessons on the timing of evaluation and the need for ongoing contestability as things change, right? And obviously geography plays and the kind of like, are those geographic cashman issues just things that we take for granted and we have to work above? Or are they those things that can be contested and put up for grabs? And I think so, like there's this central element of understanding how do we, once things become technical, they tend to get settled and people don't always go back and evaluate and revisit. And so how do we take that lesson? Because it seemed like redesign was important as design in this community. Third, I've been fixated on the need for boundary objects and boundary negotiation objects that help kind of record, organize, explore, share ideas across different communities. And obviously algorithmic impact assessments can serve this purpose, although I would suggest they rarely do. But I think your book really shows the importance of other tools and practices and other communities that play this function, these boundary spanning functions. And I would love to hear a little bit more about what sort of communities, what sorts of tools do you think we should invest in some of these more antagonistic spaces? And then lastly, I think this really important question of how do we stop the systems we design from becoming the blinders we wear? And I do think that the kind of catchments, the geographic catchments really are the source of that question for me. So I have some others, but I know we've thrown a lot at you, so I thought I would stop there.
Thank you both for such generous readings and so many thoughtful questions. And there were some, I think, important points of convergence in what you were left with by way of questions, which is instructive to me and maybe gives me a little bit of a roadmap for just briefly responding. One of the things, in fact, the first question that you each asked was how much of a template or where can this be a template? Certainly the Oregon context is extraordinary. At the same time, there are other places where public values matter. I think courtrooms are one. I think welfare or public benefit provision is one. I think the extent to which public benefit should guide what happens is itself, capital P, politically, of course, contested. So, for example, in the context of labor organizing, there's a vivid debate about the extent to which certain algorithms should be, orchestrated with respect solely to economic aims versus civic or the needs of workers. And we see this in debates, for instance, about things like shift work scheduling. But I would say that the places where I am most optimistic about bureaucratic transplant of these techniques are, I would say, our social services and criminal justice or the criminal legal system. The question of technologists not being, as Iason put it, the headline actors. I think there's a real strong tradition. I write a little bit about it in the book of a kind of humility within this community of the technical role of like, we're gonna sort of plate up for you what's possible, you, the non-data scientists, and then there'll be a debate and you can pose questions about how other alternatives might work. But it's still difficult because the technologists, of course, have the detailed knowledge that is necessary to even frame or sort of pull out the moral questions. And so that is a powerful role. I think that when we think about how to make this happen, and this maybe is in tension with the unique power that technical experts have, I think that amortizing the considerable expense of making things comprehensible across a wider, so it's one thing to say we're going to disclose everything and every interest group can do their own analysis to figure out what's at stake for them. And the nice thing about that is you're not trusting someone else to tell you how the thing works. But the less nice thing about it is you have to figure out how the thing works. And that's really hard. It's really hard without expensive professional training. It's really hard without direct firsthand experience of the system. And so I think that one of the things that's probably necessary is to take some of the key fact questions. Iason gave this example, which is also very salient for me as a recent arrival in the Bay Area, of the land use planning. I think, what would be likely to happen if we did X or Y is a question that people can't really reinvent answers to individually. And so even though whoever does our kind of analysis of record or our plain language translation of record is going to be in a position of great power and going to need to be accountable, my personal hunch is that it still is probably for the best to have that be done kind of at least have a credible effort of that kind available to everybody. In other words, use our shared resources to build some kind of shared picture of how the thing works, what the options are. And then I'll finally say that with respect to how successful or failed this process was, just as Deirdre was saying that we have to decide which factors about each person are within scope to consider in the algorithm, and we have to decide which design features of the algorithm itself are up for grabs versus sort of taken for granted as background conditions. Similarly, any effort to understand organizationally, socially, interpersonally what was going on itself has boundaries with arbitrary excluded other people outside the scope, as this book does, of who, so for example, I talk about who gets on the list as one of the things that isn't centered in this process and at the same time is very important morally. I didn't have interlocutors who had tried and failed to get listed, for instance. That's something that if given greater time and whatever, I would go back and do and have. And I think anytime you sort of constitute a community and you then get to say, well, the community agreed or the community mutually tolerated, there's the question of where's the boundary of that community and who's outside of it. And one of the respects in which this situation was not, to use in the political theory sense, an instantiation of a kind of ideal theory was that there were people not in the community that reached the imperfect agreement. There's a saying that poor people's programs are poor programs, that it's hard to get resources and for things that are designed to serve people who don't have resources. And of course, if you don't have resources, then your ability to kind of wield, to Iason's earlier point, the sort of to wield political power or to have political power, is diminished. So for the very reason that people need help, they can't get it from the rest of us. And that is endemic. And I do think there is an attitudinal aspect to this question about sort of whose interests are at stake. And certainly this gift thing compels us into this relation of equality, that if you're very wealthy, for example, but you need a donated organ. And there are, by the way, there are, well, they aren't, it's not cheating because it's allowed under federal law. But if you are a person of enormous means, you can be listed in multiple geographies. There's a federal, this is etched into the statute, which means in practice that you can get access sooner because you're rich than you could if you weren't rich. So that's, that's not fair. That the extent to which things are flattened into a relation of equality, I think could be exaggerated, but is very high in the organ transplant context. It is high, the extent to which people are treated alike despite their many differences, higher in the transplant context than in many other contexts. So I think one of the things that's at stake is where can we treat people alike more in a way that can kind of be solidaristic. I think a lot about this, we talk a lot about celebrating diversity and recognizing all the differences among people and recognizing the intersections and the distinct experiences that everyone has. And I think that's important. I think there's another thing that's also very important that can at times be occluded in that conversation, which is that it's important to also to anchor around things that people all have in common. I think about this in the design of public services institutionally. So for example, Social Security, which works the same for everyone and is more or less automatic, is very popular in the United States. Means tested programs for poor people, tend not to be as nearly as popular. And there are all these invasive, Virginia Eubanks and many others before, and not a particularly software context, have written about how, demeaning this is and how sort of stigmatizing it can be. There's a beautiful physical Carnegie Public Library a few blocks from my home in San Francisco. Carnegie built these all over the United States. It's uplifting to walk in there. Of course, not everyone lives everywhere. There are all kinds of equity issues about neighborhoods, but anyone can walk in, it's public. the library. If if there were no such thing today as public libraries, I often wonder, and somebody were to propose one, what would actually come out of our policy meat grinder today? I think a means-tested system of Amazon vouchers, not something we all can walk into, something for everyone, right? And so I personally think there is, and so I think about this in terms of trying to make a point to use public because it is what everyone has. That if I use it and I care about it, and if I, as somebody of relatively more capacity to kind of wield influence toward it, am doing that, that itself in a way is a kind of effort, a kind of vote in favor of solidarity or using the libraries or things like that. So I do think that making more things more solidaristic to the extent it's possible could influence the extent to which these transplant practices could port to other areas. And maybe I'll leave it there and see what where the conversation wants to go.
Sure. I think we want to make some space for questions from the room as well as from the Q&A. I will wait to see if hands arise, and while we wait, it's interesting to think about the extent to which the resources that poured into this effort to allocate kidneys would pour into efforts to do a similar kind of participatory process to design some of these other social service algorithms, right? And curious just at like the real politics of that, because as you said, enormous amounts of money and time and effort. And I am curious if you could talk a little bit about like who funded this stuff. How did that funding materialize?
Right. So if you are a hospital and you would like to be reimbursed by Medicare or Medicaid for anything you do anywhere in your whole hospital, and you do transplants, you have to be part of the transplant network. It's federal law, right? And then the transplant network is able, as basically a monopoly provider of the matching process, to impose user fees on hospitals that then underwrite, staff data scientists doing analyses and cross-subsidize the third-party auditor, the scientific registry, I think, of transplant recipients. I think they're cross-subsidized. It may be that they're directly federally appropriated, but it's a lot of money, and there are other accountability issues, some of which have been in the news recently, like whether the code that underpins this software is itself a copyright held by this nonprofit, is a contested question right now. So it's federal law gave them this franchise with these resources, and I wonder sometimes, it happened once for the whole country. So all of the governance cost was amortized across lots and lots of decisions in lots of different geographies. If we're talking about a vendor selling something to a local police department or a local social services office, you're looking at a much thinner resource situation, both from the point of view of money and even just people's time, right, to go into that. And so, there's in the election device context, for instance, and in other contexts, there are efforts to sort of certify or have, these kinds of, if you're gonna have many buyers of competing high stakes algorithms, how can we have some kind of good housekeeping seal or some kind of thing, and some of those get some central funding, or could be used as criteria, as you've worked on, and others in procurement, to say, is this thing, in some sense, democratically kosher, or whatever you would call it, that is, accountability that maybe ports, but it's a real challenge.
Natalia Nadzetskaya. I'm in the Department of Sociology here. Thank you so much for this really riveting discussion. I was really struck by that fourth point you brought up about how deliberation is costly. And this segues nicely from the discussion we've been having. And I guess the cost I'm interested in is time. And I'm curious to unpack this story, this question of power, and specifically the different interests that these groups brought in, and then how these processes of participation, the knowledge, the kind of experiential sharing, how that impacted the interests that groups held over time. And I guess for me, the underlying kind of context here, so we're in this very polarized kind of partisan political environment. And I'm trying to think through if we bring in processes like this to a partisan space where people have already very entrenched value systems in terms of where they stand on equity versus utility. How do you expect something like this to play out? I guess, how did you see values, if you saw values change, how did they change in these environments? And how could you kind of extrapolate some of these findings to a more kind of partisan context?
That's a really good question, or possibly several really good questions. I think if you ask somebody what they believe, you're going to get some kind of utterances. And I'm not a social scientist who studies all of the things about how questions being posed and framed changes what kind of a sense you're going to have about what people's opinions are. But we all know that to some extent, people will sort of say things about what they believe that are partly enactments or performances. They're partly cognitive based of what they believe, but also partly social, like where am I in the map of what different people think, and which part of it am I part of? And I think there is this sense, we all want to belong. And it's amazing to me, like in the context of the election, the question of election denial, like the sense of this is what my team thinks, or I want to belong to the, I think in this case, just descriptively in what I saw in the case described in the book, people believe they're part of a kind of organ transplant community. People that were involved in the governance are socialized into that. People that join the waiting list are socialized into that, right? There's some sense of owing fair treatment to everybody who is on the list. There's a sense of owing fair treatment to donors, that if you sign up to be an organ donor, that something equitable in the unlikely and sad event that your organs were ever up for giving out, that something equitable and fair would happen with them. And so I do think there's a sense of people kind of get worn down. One analogy that I mentioned in the book is I think of those machines for polishing rocks, that you tumble them until the kind of the hard edges kind of wear away a little bit. And there is this sense in which I do think exhaustion ultimately was one of the ingredients. People have been, by the time you're there, as much as the econ department might tell us that sunk costs are a fallacy, people have been flying to meetings in airport Marriotts for 10 years. They want something worthwhile to happen out of it, even if they don't agree with each other about what the best moral logic would be. And there is a point where like people's desire to have something tolerable and concrete and of worth to the world happen dominates their particular differences. And I do think that kind of wearing people down to that point was one of the key ingredients. And that might be, so that and the sense of wanting to like belong to a community that gets something done together, I think were two of the pieces that might matter elsewhere.
I just want to add one little bit, that I do think some people are softer rocks than others. And so even in that tumbler, right, having been involved in lots of like political and regulatory disputes, I think the power, of being a harder rock is really important, and I think can't be understated, even when you have like full robust participation, right? We all kind of come built out of the metal that we are, or the rock that we are, with the resources we have. And I do think that I appreciate David's suggestion that having like shared efforts at kind of fact finding and setting the base, and here's the technical analysis, can be really useful in reducing some of those participatory costs. But I think that we see in particularly like politically fraught environments, people want their own experts, right? They even if there's like a shared expert, they want their own expert. And I think particularly for people who have been minoritized, disenfranchised, having an expert who you believe is really on your team and really understands and is situated in your community, and who you trust with a big T is incredibly important in addressing that power and making your rock or your metal a little bit less soft. So, yeah.
Hey, I'm Vicki Chang. I'm a lawyer, but I have a very narrow question. In your last chart, there was white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and other. And the other went from the bottom to the top. What's other?
I don't know offhand exactly how their ontology worked. My guess would be that it's a catch-all for people who, rather than picking one of the categories, identify themselves as having a mixture, right? In order to end up in that category, you or whoever's filling out the form has to say, none of the above categories fits me, I'm somewhere else. There's also, it gets really complicated with the question of whether Hispanic or Latino or Latinx is a quote unquote racial group or an identity of a different kind. It's tracked separately in the census, but it's an evident source of confusion to many census takers. But I don't know offhand for that chart how it was done.
Hi, everyone. I'm Priyanka Nanyakara. I am a PhD student at Northwestern, but I'm visiting Berkeley this semester. And so I'm so stoked that I got to be in town for this. It was awesome. I think my question is about, like, if you could speak a little bit more about like the trade-offs that became salient in like all of these deliberations and how those trade-offs sort of formed, if they were constructed, and whether they were ever in conflict with each other. So I'm like thinking about the like utility equity one that you had on the screen, and how that was sort of, it was like the image of it made it seem like these are two things that you sort of have to trade off between. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering about that, and whether any of these trade-offs were like shown to be sort of like false in any way.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, or rather, I mean, it's making me think. I'm not the world arbiter of which questions are good, but this is one thing it makes me think of in particular is, so one of the groups that benefits the most from getting a transplant are young type 2 diabetics, because for reasons related to diabetes, they tend to do poorly on dialysis. So for them, if they get a kidney, the extent to which it increases their lifespan is greater than for most other patients who need kidneys. So they, and for other complicated medical reasons, diabetic patients, this group, they often are a candidate both for kidney and for a pancreas transplant. And because there's not overwhelming demand for pancreas transplants, there are plenty of pancreata. And so when the lift process was abandoned, one of the changes that happened was the experts said, we're going to change the way that the pancreas list works, and we're going to have the kidney that's, if someone's a pancreas donor, we're going to have one of their kidneys follow the pancreas and the other be allocated through the general kidney allocating system. And what that ended up meaning in practice was that these young type 2 diabetics, who would have been among the main beneficiaries of the lift process, were in essence, by being put in a separate line, were effectively put at the head of the line for kidneys. Just through, and it's a little bit hard for me to kind of spell this out, like all of this verbally, but it basically was a carve out that allowed, even though the lift process was set aside, it allowed some of the change in outcome that lift would have caused to happen anyway. And it was kind of a, I mean, I hesitate to call it administrative sleight of hand, but you really would have been having to watch the ball pretty closely in order to have this be vivid, what was happening there.
I'm super curious about the kind of sleight of hand, right? Like, let's pick a group for whom different rules apply. Don't anybody look over here. But I think we're going to have to save that for the conversation that happens after we close the event. So if everybody could join me in thanking Marion and Matrix, thanking Iason, and mostly thanking David for this wonderful contribution to our understanding of algorithms, and more important, organizations, people, voices that have to shape code. Thank you.
Thanks, Deirdre. Thank you, everyone.